thank you everyone for coming for the Funding the Commons track at Shelling Point. My name is Anna. I currently work at the Scylla Foundation leading community programs and community education grants. And I'm so excited to be here on the panel with Scott, Abby, and Sky. And I think we're going to frame this more as a conversation rather than an interview. So, because I think we have such a wide range of expertise here about funding network and public goods, ranging from foundations, bootstrapping grants programs, to DAOs allocating capital with decision making, to novel funding mechanisms like DAO swaps, retroactive public goods funding, and more. So I want to kick it off first to just let every panelist introduce themselves and what do you do?
Awesome. I'm Scott. I work on Gitcoin, which is a kind of program and protocol for funding public goods, funding local community shared needs, principally within the Web3 ecosystem, but also more broadly within increasingly real world applications.
Awesome. Abby?
Hi, I'm Abby. I'm the head of community and governance at Radical. Radical is basically a protocol ecosystem that's building decentralized collaboration tools that help developers build decentralized software together. I also sit on the board of the Optimism Foundation. Optimism is Ethereum's L2 baby, and they're experimenting with a lot of really exciting things in governance, which I'm supporting them with as well.
Thanks. I'm Sky. I'm a full-time contributor in the DAO space. I spend time in the DX DAO space, Metacartel, DAO House ecosystems, and recently we launched a project called Public Nouns.
Amazing. And we are all here on this panel to talk about network goods and investing in network goods. But what does that actually mean? I think a lot of the times we tend to go really abstract and really high level because we're in it 24/7. We're all working on these problems and thinking really deeply about it. But I really want to ground this conversation and talk about like what is network goods? How do you define them? And what is the role of network goods in the ecosystem?
Oh man, yeah, there's a lot of answers to this. I think we talk about a lot of different types of goods in Web3 and network goods, public goods. These are all, I think, types that have very ambiguous definitions by default. For network goods and public goods as well, like I like to think about these as things that produce positive externalities for the communities that they're part of, more so than focusing on a one particular type of good based on some economic textbook definition. With public goods, this has been a historical problem where like we talk about them as non-excludable, non-rivalrous, but there's lots of things that are clearly excludable that end up being very useful and like funded actually in the context that we think about like in previous paradigms, like by states as like public goods. So subway systems, electrical grids, even universities like are restrictive and also tend to produce lots of very valuable public goods in terms of education and so forth. So I think for me, the positive externality framing is like the most kind of simple way to start, I guess, identifying what we care about when we're talking about these kinds of goods. What is the property that we want to actually see in the world? But beyond that, I think it's like mostly up to us to better redefine and better like articulate these terms to people in simpler forms. I was almost going to like think about the idea of like positive sum goods or like super modular goods, and I think that like that it tends to be that we create new terminology sometimes like to clear semantic baggage, and in the process end up just creating more complexity.
Yeah, I really like that framing. A framing that I really like that I've heard some people use before is the benefits of others and of public goods should be axiomatic to your own benefit. And so that means it's foundational to your own.
Yeah, I think that for me, I'm always coming to all of the public goods conversation with more of a focus on free and open source software. And I think that network goods for free and open source software is infrastructure. And so I think infrastructure is this concept in which having resilient infrastructure means that you can have a resilient ecosystem of goods built on top of it, right? And so I think that a lot of the time, protocol DAOs and protocol ecosystems, their network goods are actually the infrastructure that they're contributing to and that they're maintaining. And I also think that it like speaks to, I think, other alternative or I guess external definitions of network goods in which the infrastructure is maintained, right? It's something that is maintained as a public good. I think free and open source software is a public good, and the network good of the free and open source ecosystem is really like the infrastructure that we are all contributing to. So I think that's kind of how I would define it. Yeah.
Yeah, my definition is pretty simple and high level. If there's something in your community, in your state, in places you hang out, and it's underfunded, it's likely a public good or a network good. And so you can just look across our lives, and that's how you can identify them. It's very easy, and this is what we are all trying to change. That is the problem. That's why we talk about it so much. And I come from the metacartel ecosystem. It's slaying Moloch is the term we use. It's the demon of stopping good coordination, and that is the reason why public goods are often underfunded, because no one individually fixes that, but as a group, if we actually solve it and fund it, everyone in the world is better off. And so it's very high level definition.
Amazing. And the second piece of this that I really want to ground us in is, what is a new funding mechanism, and what is it? What are the old paradigms? What is the problem with the old paradigms, and why do we need new funding mechanisms?
So one of the definitions, again, it goes back to the state and public being New York as a state, or the U.S. as a country, or wherever it might be. I think that definition is outdated for a variety of reasons. Perhaps the most important of which is that most of the things that we consider in this very both generic and simple way, to be public goods, things that we all use, things that we all rely on, that we think would make us all better off, are underfunded by those organizations or by those institutions. And I think that's true not just for government institutions, it's also true across a lot of the larger kind of institutions that we rely on, including companies, including even nonprofits. A lot of these models are, I wouldn't say outdated. I think there's value to those models, but they don't solve for especially coordination problems that tend to be very global at scale. So specifically climate change, we've had 26 or 27 COP meetings, the climate summit meetings. And, we haven't really made, I think, significant progress, which is of course my own bias, but on solving that problem. Clearly there's a lot more that we need to do to solve that problem. And if we're not solving them via those mechanisms, the solution probably isn't to just keep doing the same thing. The solution is probably to try something new and try and work with the communities that we're part of to do more locally, which I think is becoming more of a trend in the last even 5 to 10 years for us to do by default. So I think, to me, the failures of the old paradigms are mostly just, if we look around our community, what are the things that are missing, to Skye's point, and why are those things being missed in the first place? And I think part of this goes back to, how we're framing the things we care about, what we're relying on ourselves for, as individual, networks of just people, versus what we're relying on this abstract entity and abstract sort of these notions, these egregores we built up, to solve for us. So I'm gonna stop before I get it too off track, but yeah, that's my thinking.
Yeah, Abby, do you wanna have something to add to old funding paradigms?
Yeah, I think my perspective on the paradigms that need to be changed with regards to funding network goods, public goods, definitely kind of has been contextualized by the evolution of the internet, which is a network good, a public good in a sense. It at its core, it's like an interconnected network of open protocols, of decentralized open protocols, right? And I just talked about this in my talk on the other stage, but over the evolution of the internet, we've seen it become more and more captured by forces who are attempting to extract, surveil, and control the nature of the internet, right? In an effort to extract profit by extracting and manipulating and using data. And so this capture of the internet has gotten to a point where we don't, many people I think in this generation wouldn't see the internet as what it was when it started, right? Again, like a network of decentralized protocols. They'd see the internet as FANG, as Facebook, as Google, as Amazon, and people that contextualization change, I think, speaks to how the funding paradigm for open source software and open source infrastructure are inherently broken because they aren't resilient to these external forces that in their capture and in their extraction are slowly building and monopolizing and consolidating the internet into the hands of these individual corporations. And so I think that it's not just broken, it's like critically broken and damaged to a point where you actually it's becoming harder and harder to envision a future in which us as humans are actually able to maintain online civil liberties, such as like privacy, like financial privacy, financial access, even like technical access. And so like the more that the internet centralizes because of the non-existence of resilient independent funding paradigms, the more we'll see the traditional paradigm take over control and continue to consolidate. And I think that that's like a very dangerous thing, especially for our space, which is where the digital public goods that we're funding are these like financial privacy preserving technologies, which are like banking the unbanked, which are providing open access to finance. And this is an extremely ideological and argument that we're making, which is that people should have open access to finance, to the economy. And it's something that even more so than before challenges like the current funding paradigms that we have. So more of a rant on kind of why I think it's important, but I think that the way that it's so broken has created this situation for us that now we're all trying to kind of find our way out of.
Yeah, I think the old way was dependent on big central counterparties. So the internet, all of the protocols that it runs on were either government or in academic institutions' money, centralized entities. I think Kevin Owaki taught me that Linux was like Microsoft would give money, and they were like one of the only people funding Linux, because who else was going to fund Linux, right? And so those are all centralized. Now, with this technology that we have, you can do basically, we have an example like Wikipedia. Wikipedia is funded by the people, right? Everyone donates $25 every year. They ask you for the money, you give it. With crypto, it's even easier. So now the people can not only fund these important things, but they can actually own a piece of the protocol. And so they're even more incentive aligned to fund it and be a part of it. And that's the power of the crowd, yeah.
Yeah, can I just add one comment on that? Because I like what you said about like the original funding sources for a lot of, whether it be like public goods infrastructure, like digital public goods infrastructure, it's the concept of like intermediation, and that we are dependent on intermediaries. And sometimes that's fine, because actually sometimes intermediaries can be good, like they can be like value aligned. And I think we've seen that, like for example, with like Mozilla spawning Rust and contributing to the decentralization of Rust, or the EFF funding Tor, right? However, I think the point is why that's broken is because it's because of a future state in which more and more corporations are attempting to extract, to the point in which those anti-competitive forces will outweigh the value-aligned forces that have been driving our traditional funding paradigms. And that's like really, I think, the reason why we're looking for new ones is because it's because of the tragedy of the commons. I think we've already seen it play it out in like kind of like traditional physical public goods, and now we're starting to see similar trends in the digital sphere, and we're trying to combat that.
Yeah, and I want to just pick up one thread from that and talk about one of the traditional funding paradigms, talking about VC funding and private capital, because we still have a lot of that in the Web3 space. And Scott, I want to ask this question to you. What do you think is the role of private capital in funding public goods infrastructure in Web3?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of need for, again, like having the crowd involved, and I think having the crowd involved is a necessity for truly community-owned infrastructure. I think there's two thoughts I have on this. I guess the first thought is that there's lots of things that have been privately funded, like universities, that have ended up creating lots of good positive externalities for broader communities. The question, I think, to the points that were made earlier is just like, in what way are we reliant on those institutions, and in what way is the power sort of like, where is the power held? Where is like the nexus of control? And like, how do we make sure that that's like distributed more broadly to the community, and make sure that like the institutions are held accountable in some way? I think you see a lot of problems with this with like large scale VC funding and even Web3, where like large players will like come in and they'll like put crazy amounts of capital into like a network, and then you'll see, you know, like with a lot of like new like ETH killer types of projects, like you know, there's some even that are launching like this year that like I think tend to be very VC heavy, very VC owned. I think that tends to be a challenge that I think needs to be solved over time. But on the other hand, I think there's value in having private capital be part of the conversation in public goods funding. And I think we've almost become allergic to that notion because of the fact that we're so used to the sort of like state being the only entity that can do this kind of like work, and for it to be the only entity for which it's like actually properly incentivized to do that work. But like, as you're talking about with optimism, I think there's this idea that we can actually somehow align impact and profit in the Web3 world through these ownership models that in a way that hopefully solves some of this problem, at least at small scale. I guess for me, it's a matter of like degree. And I think so if you're a fund doing like, early pre-seed investment in like shared infrastructure, that kind of thing, to me, that would be very valuable. And I'd love to see more funds sort of doing that. I think the bigger challenge is when you get these in any institution really to a scale where they're just constantly kind of like almost Ouroboros, like the style, like eating themselves. And I think that's where we're at with like even a lot of the large sort of like players in the space, which is why like we need some sort of like way to break those up. But yeah, I think private capital is maybe unfairly aligned in some contexts. And maybe that's like, the question of just balance in all things. But I think it's important to kind of take both sides of that and explore that like more deeply, especially in the next cycle, because clearly we're in a bit of a bear market now. And in the next cycle, I think it's up to us to decide what we actually end up doing and what that balance looks like.
Yeah, and just to double click on that, I would love to hear your thoughts on how you've seen this play out at Gitcoin, from Gitcoin Now moving to Gitcoin DAO, and the work that you're now doing with PG DAO.
Yeah, so ultimately my goal with any experiments that we're running tends to be ultimately about how do we get more funding into the hands of grantees and to builders earlier rather than later. And I think this is a problem with traditional funding models where you kind of need people to almost prove themselves as like a business person or a like founder type versus just being a builder who has an interesting idea and wants to see that out in the world. I mean, I think someone like even Vitalik, like if they went to A16Z today, would probably not end up potentially getting funded if they didn't know who he was, because they would just think like, oh, like this is just some kind of moonshot idea. And that was true in like 2015. No one would touch like the crowd fund. No one would touch any of the work that he was doing. And it was only later that people kind of retroactively said, oh, we were like totally on board with this the whole time. We were like super excited about it. This is like amazing. And we need more people to take bets earlier on people that have good ideas and are passionate about those ideas. So I think grants funding is one part of that, but I would love to see, I mean, in the last cycle, Gitcoin funded things like Uniswap, it funded things like Yearn, it funded things like POAP, things like Optimism. And I think that it could really, stand to benefit from potentially taking some upside in a retro kind of PGF type fashion in those projects. So there's some exploration around what that might look like. And I think it's a, ongoing conversation, but hopefully as we head to the next cycle, that'll be an interesting exploration.
Yeah, and Gitcoin Grants has done a tremendous job seeding the ecosystem. And just to pick up on the retroactive public goods funding, I don't know, Abbey, if you want to contribute more about how you think about that at Optimism.
Yeah, I think that, so I think that the concept of private capitals, for me coming from this like free and open source space, is that like people in the free and open source space have this like treat money differently than people in the crypto space, is that we look at it as like, well, people in free and open source treat money as like a lawful evil in which like money ruins all things. And this is kind of why I think this comes from like the free and open source ecosystems based off of like volunteerism, solve your own problems and all of that, and collective contribution. And then we kind of look at it as this more like chaos magic almost, right? Like it's a chaotic good. It's something that we can use to redesign incentives and all of that. However, I think that it is, just because something is decentralized in its ownership doesn't mean that it's actually, combating the effects of centralization within the project. So just because something is technically decentralized, just because a treasury is governed by a token voting governance mechanism, definitely does not mean that it's not centralized. And I think that the role that we've seen VCs play in Web3 and crypto speaks to that paradigm in which we all talk about it, I think, openly here, which is that a lot of these systems are just representing plutocracies with VCs at the helm and driving all of the governance that we're doing. Yes, it's a little bit more decentralized than the traditional corporate model, but it's still pretty centralized, in which either the founding team members or the earliest investors in a project could swing any vote and direct any DAO in any way. And I think that this is an important point because it's fine that it's like this. We just need to make it better. And I think it's more about figuring out how we can kind of build more diverse and engaged decentralized governance mechanisms that we can use to combat the external forces that will eventually, regardless of how value aligned they are, will eventually turn to these ecosystems to extract. That's just the way it works, and you can't blame them. This is like literally what their corporate forms are based off of. This is how they're designed. We just need to harness the good parts of that, which is that there is value in taking private capital to jumpstart an idea, and there is a way to provide a return on an investment. However, that return on that investment must not compromise the ideologies and the foundations of the technologies that it's stewarding. And I think that's exactly what we're trying to do. That's like what our ultimate goal is to prove that that works. That's what we're doing at Radical by transitioning our company, which was like a German GmbH. We transitioned it to a foundation, which is like a Swiss foundation. And now we're transitioning to the DAO. And in that process, we're not just, we launched a DAO, but I wouldn't say that we're an effective DAO yet. We're token governed, but I don't think that we're not a plutocracy. And the goal now is to be distributing ownership and influence in a way that we can transition power and voice into the hands of the participants of that ecosystem and that network in an effort to support its continued decentralization into the future, because we're not at that future state yet. And same with optimism, right? Optimism is experimenting with how can we recreate the actual funding mechanisms by making public goods profitable, by using retro PGF and developing a governance network around the governance of that pool of capital to deploy it into an ecosystem in a way that's sustainable and guarantees long-term investment because of redefining like the actual incentives of the way that works. And that's like the new paradigms that we're doing. And it's so like we're not there yet, but it's kind of the future state of where we're going. So VCs aren't evil, but like eventually they will be, because that's just how they're programmed. And the goal is using VC funding to build a system that can remain resilient to that extraction in the future.
Hear me out. Civil resistance, quadratic voting. This is sorry, Sky.
Yeah, so I'm slightly biased, but DAOs solve this. An example is, ETH2 wasn't getting funding, and you can do this on a grants basis or you can do this on an investment basis. It's just more legally hard on an investment basis, but ETH2 wasn't being built. Amin Soleimani created Malik DAO, built it from scratch, made a DAO that was very simple and worked, started funding the building, furthering the building of ETH2, and now we have, proof of stake Ethereum. It took a few years, but he did that without anyone's permission. He didn't have to ask the permission of VCs, of the Ethereum Foundation, or anyone else. You can just, as a community, do this, and you can fund anything you want, and that's, all related to what we're doing here. Yeah, Tornado Cash, they funded that. Then you had those were grants DAOs and Metacartel, and then they started experimenting with investment versions of that. So you can also win in the upside without the VCs by creating DAOs that Metacartel Ventures and the Lao started investing in the projects in the space. Some of those are public goods, some of those are other projects in the DeFi space and stuff. But you don't. And actually, what's really interesting is this behavior that we're doing here will eventually force VCs to become more friendly VCs, I think, and that's what's amazing is what we as individuals can actually change the behavior of these big financial institutions.
Yeah, this is very quickly the biggest part to me that I think if anyone takes anything away from this, it's we can like the notion of prefigurative politics basically is just that you're actually taking action towards the world you want to see. And I think we often see criticism without action. I think that's very common both in Web 2, even arguably in the AI space. I think we have to solve the alignment problem, whatever. I'm not going to dive into that. But I think that we talk about it as if who's going to solve this is the person who's always criticizing the research that's happening. And I think there's a balance to be had in terms of how we actually build new systems. What are we doing to solve what are new paradigms? We're just building parallel tracks that solve basically in hopefully better ways the problems that we saw in the old systems. That's all we're doing.
Yeah. I love all of these things, and I just want to riff on. I think there's three things that come to mind when I think about funding ecosystems and new paradigms. And to me, it all boils down to three things that if someone can take anything away from this, it's I think we need independent thinking, we need independent process, and we need independent sources of funding. And what those three things mean to me, independent thinking means that you can have community-based decisions, you can have DAOs make decisions, you can have someone say, like, we believe that this is important, we want to fund this. So this has to do with having the ability to have an independent thinking process. And then independent process has to do with, like, how do we tap into funding for grants? Like, foundations are notorious for deploying capital pretty slowly because they have, like, a specific diligence process, but you can fund something with a DAO with a proposal in a very different way. And then you can do something like Gitcoin grants, which is a whole separate process. And then independent sources of funding, because funding allows you to have agency and autonomy over how to deploy those funds. And I would love to go into all three of those and to see if you have, like, any meaningful examples. But maybe we would first go to Sky, because I would love to hear your thoughts on independent thinking first, and how do community decisions play in public nouns?
Public noun specific, you said?
Public nouns
Oh.
or yeah. Or
Well,
previous.
yeah, so yeah, what you described there is like a complex way of saying we need like lots of crazy experiments, I think. And this space is that's why this space is so fun, is everyone just like comes up with crazy experiments, and sometimes they get funded and sometimes they don't, and sometimes you're like, you know what, we don't need funding, we're just gonna build it. We got guys like Lewis back there that just build it, right? And so yeah, maybe I can just, so one example is looking at the space and seeing where money is flowing, right? So there's this project called Nouns DAO. You collect these PFPs, they're one a day, and all the money goes into a treasury. And that treasury, which has $40 million today, is being used to like propagate the meme of nouns. Nouns is a CC0, like anyone, you can print it on a shirt and you can sell them here at Shelling Point, and it's all CC0, there's no rules, right? So what we did is we see that happening in the space, and there's a lot of fans of this mechanism, and we basically took that mechanism, because you're allowed to, we forked it, and we made it all for public goods. And so 12 days ago, we launched this thing called Public Nouns, which is basically Nouns DAO, but it's called Public Nouns DAO. And it's, yeah, one of these is sold every 12 hours forever, and all the money's going into the treasury. There's no cut going anywhere. And that is, and one noun is equal to one vote. One public noun is equal to one vote. And that community, which is starting to form, will decide what to use this money for. There's currently 99 ETH in the treasury, and so you can check it out. But what we did is when we launched it, we had organizations that have the same kind of ethos and alignment in the public goods space, like organizations that love public goods. So we had Radical and Gitcoin and Panvala and Optimism and Metacartel and Moloch and CRL Fund were the initial organizations that all got together and built this, forked it, and launched it. And now we have this pot of money that we want to give to people that are doing crazy experiments in the public goods space. And so this is a brand new way of funding public goods, but we're not going to just donate the money to the public goods. We want to give it to people that are coming up with crazy ways to also fund public goods. And so if we're going to get to billions and trillions of dollars that we need to fund all the public goods and network goods that we want, we need an exponential effect. So we're going to use this money to find the young builders that are like creating the next platform that's going to get like to $1 billion, and then that money can go to public goods. And so that's an example of a brand new way to invent a mechanism to fund public goods that hasn't been tried before.
Abbey, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, a lot of things. First, public nouns are awesome. You should definitely go. The seedling is the best noun. So if you're looking for one to get the seedling. So I think that we were talking about independent process, independent funding, and independent thought, right? Yeah. No, we wanted to rant on public nouns. It's good. No, so I think that those three categories speak very speak well to me. They speak to me in that they definitely represent a lot of the decentralization that we're doing with Radical. So right now we're transitioning all of our foundation. The Radical Foundation currently governs and maintains and manages all of the funding for Radical core development. And we're actually currently transitioning all of the core teams that are funded by the foundation to the Radical DAO. And that doesn't just mean throwing them into the DAO and saying, okay, you know, here you go, like engage in this like super plutocratic, like on-chain governance system. It means starting to design the foundations for a more member-based organization in which these core teams can, one, organize within themselves as an autonomous organization within the DAO itself. So creating an independent process in which these organizations actually can build their own governance process, one that best fits their mandate and what they're trying to do, and spawn and support the creation of these orgs that act again as these like nested polycentric squads of people who are governing themselves together, yet all abide by rules that are set by the DAO. So basically you're embedding trust by creating like sovereign governance mechanisms that are supported by checks and balances that are encoded in rules. And so these, you know, organizations can act as independent thought process and funding sources, yet also be trusted by the DAO to be making the right decisions, because the on-chain governance guarantees that if one of these independent, orgs goes rogue, the DAO will be able to take action, right? And so that takes a lot of work. So it doesn't just happen in a day. It requires the distribution of ownership, the distribution of influence, the empowerment of individuals within the organizational design. But that's kind of like where we're going with Radical DAO. And so I think that this is also the way a lot of DAOs will go, which is like the modularization and the localization of decision making to, you know, I think that this whole direct to DAO approach will, you know, kind of resolve itself into more localized decision-making centers that are all interacting with each other.
So we kind of talked about thought a little bit, free thought, experiments, process. Yeah. So I'll talk about funding. We'll let you cover it that way. I think for me, like quadratic funding is really the idea of using community sentiment to build a kind of preference map of what people care about. Not just what, like, again, like whales care about, but what a broader community cares about in a local sense. So even, you know, in a local sense digitally, like for example, the Uniswap ecosystem, but also in a local sense physically. For example, we ran around with like Oakland on nonprofits that were raising funds for their own needs there. And I think in each of those cases, what you're trying to do is like what do we mean by independence, right? I think what we mean is communities are governing themselves. Communities are governing themselves as a network, like without large institutions that are kind of creating barriers for them or possibly like co-opting what they're doing. And they're able to do that pretty permissionlessly in a way that hopefully still relies on, like in the context of quadratic funding, like large scale funders who have that ethos and want to see those kinds of initiatives funded. So the goal of quadratic funding is not just this preference mapping, but also allowing larger philanthropic entities, even potentially like more antiquated entities, to sort of upgrade their funding model and hopefully still support people, but with people being front and center in the decision-making process. And I think that sort of way of funding is hopefully something that, again, like as we sort of go towards a protocol launch, like the DAO is sort of one step towards decentralization for us in a similar way as Radical. But now in terms of the protocol, what we're trying to do is allow people to create their own local ecosystem funding rounds and do that pretty independently from even operating or interacting with the DAO at all. And so hopefully that forkability becomes, you know, more of a trend within the ecosystem. I think like that forkability of nouns, forkability of things that we're all talking about here is like part of the core reason we're here, and that's like an important part of funding.
Yeah, well, with the remainder of 5 minutes that we have, I really want to go into how do we make sure, how do we ensure long-term sustainability of these new funding paradigms? I know that there's a lot of experiments with alternative funding paradigms like DAO swaps, and Abbey or Scott, you can pick up this thread, but I think I'm gonna kick it over to you.
Yeah, cool. So I think that there's like a couple things that we need to focus on for long-term sustainability. The first is like actually truly experimenting and improving our multi-stakeholder decentralized governance mechanisms, because I think a lot of organizations are suffering from that right now, and we really need to start figuring out how to build better ones. So I think that that's like one really important thing, is to have really diverse and active multi-stakeholder governance that has really good ways for community participants to voice, right? So I think like multi-stakeholder governance is one, and then I think that there's a disintermediation of funding sources. So this is anything from like experimenting with more independent funding sources like grant DAOs or decentralizing ownership away from VCs. But there's also like a lot of like inter-ecosystem resilience that we can be building, which I think will be like crucial for long-term sustainability of everything, right? So like one example of this, which is something that we haven't announced yet, so this is a little bit of alpha, we'll probably be announcing it like next week or something, is that Radical and Gitcoin actually just passed a proposal through both of their governance ecosystems, and we have now formed the Public Goods Alliance, in which Radical and Gitcoin have now become a top 10 delegate in each other's DAOs. In an effort to increase not only participation in governance as well, but to distribute ownership and influence to mission-aligned organizations in both of our DAOs to support long-term resilience. And so this Public Goods Alliance is something that's been in the works for a while between Radical and Gitcoin, but it's officially passed through governance, and it now has been formed. It's something that we're going to be launching, and ultimately we see becoming another form of independent process, independent thought, and independent funding in which we can work together as an organization, scope our desires and our mandate, and direct funding into public good that supports the resilience of both of our organizations. And I think that these DAO-to-DAO collaborations and ecosystem resilience plays will be incredibly crucial for securing long-term sustainability of, for me, I think open source infrastructure, but I think Scott would also say for general public's good funding in general. And so I think we're seeing more of these ecosystem interactions, like think of Kevin's talk today about the DAO of DAOs, about super modularity, about optimism with retro PGF. And I think we need to like really lean into these mechanisms and these relationships, because I think that that's what will keep us surviving in the future and thriving in the future.
Yeah, I think that the beauty of Web3 is that you actually have the ability for ecosystems to naturally collaborate versus, I think, compete. And this is part of just the built-in economics of open source. The traditional sort of framing of any kind of like, even like going back to the notion of like a commons, like there's this notion that if you take a fish, like someone else is going to have that fish and so forth. In the context of open source software, any new software built is generative. Other people can build on it. You have much more kind of funding that you can like deploy, much more kind of like time that you can commit to something because you have much more to build on top of instead of just building from scratch. Those are all things that like I think lead to DAOs and other kinds of like Web3 organizations being naturally more interdependent and being willing to take on these kinds of partnerships. And I do hope that over time we can see more folks sort of like join this coalition, join this alliance, and be part of that kind of conversation, because I think that's like one of the things that we have in Web3 that hasn't really existed in previous paradigms.
Yeah, and then in closing thoughts, I just want to go and give everyone a chance to say, what can people do to learn more and to participate in designing new funding mechanisms? I want to kick it over to Sky first.
Yeah, I had one closing thought to the last conversation too, that so I think the most important public good that we have is the planet. And so there's actually an example. So Patagonia, the company, their mission as a company was to save the planet. And now all of the money they actually have is going to saving the planet, right? And so you don't have to have just protocols dedicating like 10% of their money to public goods. You can actually have real world private companies and public companies give money to public goods. We just need to we need to show them that it's okay and it's actually benefiting their ecosystem and everyone. And then, yeah, once it's okay, then their shareholders won't just complain that they're not making more profits. And so they'll all start giving money to public goods too. And I think our space will show the world how to do that.
Where can they learn more about public nouns?
Yeah. So public nouns. So publicnouns.wtf is the site. You can check it out. Ven is back there handing out some cards. The public noun number 10, as part of the protocol, goes to the actual public nouns DAO. And the public nouns DAO has decided to give that public noun away at the end of Shelling Point today. And so if you go on the public nouns Twitter you can nominate a person that has done amazing work in the public good space and why, and that person will, the group will get together and one person will win this. And so this is effectively a retroactive public noun like money, public nouns drop. So it's retroactive funding, but instead of it being money, it's an actual public noun, which will then give them governance in the public nouns ecosystem. So it combines retroactive funding plus DAO plus public nouns plus community participation, and you can't nominate yourself. So you have to nominate someone else in the space.
Woo! Public noun. Yeah, so first, purpose, trust over DAO as always. We love that. I think that the more that we can be experimenting with mechanisms and showing people how it works, the more we're actually going to be able to do it. If you can't see it, you can't do it. For Radical, we're in the midst of this transition, and there's a ton of work ahead of us. And so you can follow me, which is like Abbey, ABBEY_Titcomb, TITCOMB on Twitter, and Radical online to kind of like see how this transition is going. We're talking a lot about it. Everything's public on our forum, radical.community, and it's something that we're going to be talking more about the more we try to make this happen. So I think we have one experiment like right now in process, and I'm really excited to see how it works, and hopefully we're going to learn a lot about it that we can share with the ecosystem. So
Awesome. I know we're pretty much out of time. If you want to run your own local grants round, please, like, definitely Gitcoin is looking for more people that want to do that, more projects that want to do that. If you want to support public goods, we'll be doing rounds. We'll be continuing to support public goods in terms of the quadratic funding rounds that we usually do. And then beyond that, I would just say public goods are good. Just please donate in any of these ways, experiment. Let's just keep funding as many public goods as we can.
Yeah, and that's all the time we have. We're going to be continuing this conversation over at DevCon, so I'm super excited, and thank you all for joining me on this panel.
thank you for moderating.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.